I had a lady who came on a workshop I was doing, and she kept saying, I don't hear God speak, I don't hear God speak. And I just felt like God say, ask her about the songs in her head. And I said, do you have songs in your head? And she said, oh yes, whenever I'm talking to somebody, I have these songs. Sometimes I don't know them, but I'll just share the song. And then it's always just the right moment. I was saying, well, that's God. And she's like, but is he allowed to speak that way? I'm like, well, he created music. I'm pretty certain he's allowed to speak that way.
Welcome to the Prophecy Project, an accessible prophecy podcast. In each episode, we explore some aspect of prophecy, from theology and practical aspects of hearing God, through to leading healthy prophetic cultures and exploring how prophecy can enhance local mission. Accessible Prophecy is a global ministry that helps individuals grow in the prophetic and helps local churches grow healthy and mature prophetic cultures. And now, here is your host, Christine Wanstall.
Welcome back to the Prophecy Project, an accessible prophecy podcast. It's great to have you listening with us this morning. I am flying solo this morning. We've given Andrew the podcast off, and today it is my absolute delight to be joined by Ceri Harris. Ceri is an amazing leader in the UK, and I'm loving the opportunity to chat with her this morning about her own journey with accessible prophecy, with hearing God, with prophecy, with the whole works today. Ceri, everything's on the table, so I'm excited to have a chat to you. How are you?
I'm doing good. I always love chatting to you, Chris, so it's always a joy. Yeah, no, I'm doing good, thank you. It is not the morning here, but that means soon I might actually get to go to bed, Always
like
a joyful moment.
Exactly. So, Ceri, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you? Where do you live in this amazing creative world? And what do you do?
Yeah. So I currently live in Ipswich, which is in England. It's in a county called Suffolk. It's about an hour. It's the east of England. It's about an hour from London, which would kind of be a known place. But I'm actually a Welsh girl, so I grew up in Wales. So I always say great rivalry between the Welsh and the English. So I always say I'm on missionary service to England from Wales. It's a gift from Wales to help convert these heathens to. So
Now,
to all the English people.
in Australia, we have some competition between various Australian states. I'm assuming it's the same, although in the UK you see yourselves as different countries. Is that right?
So, well, now if you really got the Welsh going, we're actually a principality, not a country. They don't even give us country status. So no, we are. So it's whatever. So we've got England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales is part of the UK. So Wales would be bigger than England if you flattened it out with all the hills, but it's the bit on the side.
I love that you found a way to absolutely make it bigger than England.
Absolutely. It just needs rolling out. That's all it is. It's just, So we've lived in Suffolk for 28 years. We really love it. It's a place God led us to, and I miss mountains. Suffolk isn't mountainous, but like Wales, but it's got these great big open skies that are just beautiful. So it feels very much home. So my husband and I came here 28 years ago to lead a church, which we still do. And alongside that, I'm an executive coach. So I work anything around culture change, leadership development. If you can coach it, I'll have a go. Anything in business field is kind of the areas I spend a lot of my time in.
Great. So how did you, there's a few things in there I just want to pick up. One is 28 years. Have you been leading in the same church for that length of time?
We have. But interestingly, the church that we're in now is very different. So it's gone through many iterations. So when we came, we knew two things. Firstly, we knew we didn't want to come. The second thing, we knew that God was telling us 100% is where we're meant to go. So after both having an evening and a night where we kind of asked God where the whale was and was there another option, a bit like Jonah, we both knew definitely it's where God was leading us. And we'd always lived in cities. This was at the time very rural. It's not in the same way now. It is a town, and we've got great stuff here, but it's taken a long time for some of those things to grow. So we've gone through lots of stages as a church. First of all, it was kind of getting people on the bus and the bus pointing in the right direction. We got to the stage where you can change lots of things, and we quickly became a very good attractional model of church that was growing in all ages, and it looked great. But my husband and I were the most dissatisfied we'd ever been, I think, in our ministry. So we went on a sabbatical with people saying, you must be so pleased, this is great. And we were thinking, Lord, we can't carry on like this. And I think the frustration for us was we were growing, and we were growing all the time. And we were growing because we were raping other churches and becoming the church to be at, which we'd never sought to be and never wanted to do. And so we really were saying to God, if our job is to save the least, the last, and the lost, then actually, if you measure it by that, we're not doing a great job. And yes, we see baptisms, and yes, we do see some people coming to faith, but not in the way that we'd expect to see. And so we really sought God, and God brought amazing people into our pathway who helped shape our thinking. And we started a journey of dismantling the attractional church we'd created into a church whose the engine that drives it isn't just Sunday, but it's now community and celebration. And so we got some really quick wins of lots of people coming to faith and amazing things happening. But we also repopulated a whole other church with the people that weren't so happy with what was happening, because the area we grew most in originally was in homeless, addiction, people living on the streets. And it was messy, which I think looks a lot like Jesus. And we quickly discovered that we had to put blue lights in our toilets, because apparently you can't shoot up your veins under blue lights because you can't see them. These kind of situations that when you start to change, you don't know you're going to lean into. And some people just kind of would say, we believe in the least, the last, and the lost, but we don't want to have to step over them on a Sunday. And at that point, you just think, well, honestly, be blessed to be somewhere else, because actually this is messy, but I think it looks like Jesus. And so the church now is incredibly different to the church we came to 28 years ago. It's a very different animal, both in terms of the way it looks, the buildings we've added, the demographic of people that come, the way that actually the engine, as I said, that drives us is community and celebration. It's not celebration. We do that still, but it's not the main event. The main thing is what we do day to day in community with people. So it is very different. Yeah. But it's still a long time.
And I can see how, you were saying that you're an executive coach and cultural change is one of your pieces, because what you've just described there is 28 years of cultural change.
Exactly. And I think there have been 3 major culture change shifts within that period. And I think that's why, and actually, because had been there so long, longevity was in our favour. We'd built a lot of relational capital, which is, without that, culture change is very difficult without trust. And so actually, culture change moments have been easier, even though culture change is always difficult to lead through. They've been easier to lead through because we had the relational capital behind us and we had that trust there, which makes a huge difference, I think, as you transition, because there's an element that says, well, you did this last time and that worked. So I don't agree with you, but we'll give it a go. But actually that trust is essential for culture change to really start to embed and actually change things, not just in name. It's easy to have buzzwords, but culture change is as much a heart issue as it is anything else. And so actually you have to change hearts and minds, and relational capital and trust is the bedrock of that, I think.
Now, you've talked a little bit through that there's this lovely theme around we went away, we felt God say, we heard God, we felt God talk to us. Tell me more about your own prophetic journey of recognizing and hearing God's voice in your life?
Yeah, so as a child, the Bible said God spoke. So I spoke to God and he spoke back. And it was as simple as that for me. So I took that at its word and asked God and assumed that was everybody's worldview. As I grew, I started to realize that people actually really struggled to hear God's voice. And I found that perplexing. And then I remember being 16 and going to a worship leaders conference, and we were in a session and they were talking about, who'd stand up if you'd like to be, the gift of prophecy to be prayed into your life. And I just remember thinking, who on earth would want that? And that's because I'd met quite a few prophets who were a little bit mad and they dressed badly. And honestly, at 16, I didn't fancy either of those two things, in all honesty. So they were just two things I wasn't very keen on. And so I was like, oh, who would do that? And the next thing I knew is people are laying hands on me. And I opened my eyes and realized I'm standing up. But I had been sitting down making the decision that I would never stand up, because who would want that? So I came out of that a little perplexed and kind of sensing God and just saying to God, I think this is best if we keep it between ourselves. There was a real sense for me that, okay, I hear you, that's great. Let's just keep that down low and not go out there. That worked. Burying my head in the sand worked for a little while, until I started to understand as I grew about stewardship and God actually wanting good reward from the gifts he placed in us. And also starting to realize that if I was going to lead, I need to lead by God's voice, but I need to help others lean into that. So I was in this quandary where it meant I have to actually accept that there's this gift and start to actually learn about it and utilize it. And I would say for a long time, I was in the kind of awareness, the application space. I instinctively would use the gift. But actually, I had to go through a period of growing in awareness. How do I use the gift? What does that look like for me? My youngest son is a competitive sailor, and so my husband and I have been learning to sail. And I often think about my prophetic journey when I'm doing it, because when I sail, my son would want to get the whiteboard out before I sail and, write things up and teach us. And my husband's lapping it up, and I'm thinking, yeah. And then I get on the water and I think, oh, right, that rope, I need to do that. And I can just do it and it works. And if you say, well, how did you do that? I'll be like, I don't know, I just did. And it was very much like that for me with prophecy. How did you do that? I don't know, it just is. Whereas my husband looks at the awareness, he gains knowledge, then he's in the boat and thinking, okay, so I do this and this is why it happens. And it doesn't happen as quickly for him, but actually he can teach somebody else. So, and instinct is great for first generation disciples, right? But if I ever wanted to do something with it, I needed to grow in learning. So I started to really invest in finding out what it meant to be a prophet, what it meant to lead people by hearing his voice, what it looked like to steward that well, what the shadow sides of that were, what it meant to do that from a heart that was soft. And then for years, I think my cry still was, there's a lot of really bad examples of prophecy out there that I don't feel really greatly comfortable with, because they don't seem to strengthen, encourage and comfort, which is clearly what it talks about around prophecy, which is when I came into contact with accessible prophecy. And finally, for me in that moment, it was a sweet spot of, this is a tribe that I'd like to be part of, who are doing what it says on the tin. They're making prophecy accessible. It's something that's healthy, holistic, well-boundaried. So that's kind of the journey. I think in different stages of the journey of hearing God speak, I've tried to lean into hearing God in different ways, because it's easy just to go with what you know. But actually, as I've grown, I've wanted to kind of grow in sharpness and clarity around the gift, and in the ways of what postures internally I can make to make sure that I'm positioning myself to hear. So I've tried to understand the things that block me from hearing God's voice, and try to keep growing in it. Firstly, myself as a disciple. Secondly, to steward it well, and thirdly, as a leader. I don't know if that answers your question.
It totally does. And it's a fantastic, you've taken us, I feel like we've gone around the world with what you've talked about, because there's a whole lot there around multiplying leaders, which I think we can talk about. We talk about a lot about how do you hear God, what's it like for you individually to steward well your gift, but actually there is a whole multiplication piece that God gives in Ephesians 4 around the gifts of the church to strengthen and equip the church. And that's really that piece of multiplying leaders, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's essential. And I think that's the posture, isn't it? It's so often people want you to be the prophet, the sage on the stage who just gives the word. Whereas actually for me, I guess my lens is always, how do I help people hear God themselves? So I've got 4 children, and I definitely parented in a way that the most important thing for me was for them to connect with God's voice, because you can talk relationship with Jesus and you can have all these things, but if they're not really experiencing God, it can be something that's difficult to hold tangibly, can't it? So they recognize that often I would just know stuff. God would speak. And so they would come and say, Mom, what do you think I should do about so-and-so? Wanting to short circuit the process. And I would say, have you asked the Father yet? And to start with, I used to say, okay, how about you go to your room, you ask the Father, I'll sit by here and ask the Father, and then let's talk about it. In the end, I just had to say, have you asked the Father? And I just go. Before then, they were going, yeah. Why do I have to do it myself? Stomping up the stairs. But then they'd come back and they'd met with Jesus. They'd heard the Father's voice. And actually, then the conversation was around, okay, what do I do with this? How do I activate what it is that God has spoken? And so I think that's the posture I always take around the prophetic gift, is how do I release it in others and call out the gift in others when you see it? Because often people just don't have language for it, if that makes sense. One of my daughters is definitely horizontal prophet. Her whole life is about justice and about trying to bridge all that's broken in the world and all that's beautiful in God's kingdom with the way she lives. And so, but she would never have counted herself really as a prophet without the language to explain, okay, this is where I sense, feel, think. How does that resonate for you? And therefore it becomes something that people can own and steward themselves. But actually to do that, I think you have to think multiplying.
The question that comes to my brain as you're chatting then, Ceri, is around, I think intuitively for people who are gifted in that prophetic space, there is an ease or a natural sense or acceptance as you step into that. I totally resonate coming across accessible prophecy stuff and just feeling like I've come home. That sense of finding the tribe for me is very true. What would you say around helping to equip people who may not be gifted in the prophetic, but we have a very clear value that everyone can hear God's voice? Absolutely. And so what would your tips be about those who say, I don't hear God, I don't recognize his voice? Give us some wisdom.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. The starting point for me is that there are everyday ways that God speaks. So God has spoken, God is speaking, and God will always speak through the Bible. So there are times for everybody where either a word has been preached or they've seen a word, and somehow that's connected with something within them. Helping people to recognize that's a way that God speaks, I think, is a first basis. For me as well, for a lot of people, nature is a way that they just connect with something greater than themselves. So help them to understand that God speaks in multiple ways. I had a lady who came on a workshop I was doing, and she kept saying, I don't hear God speak, I don't hear God speak. And I just felt like God say, ask her about the songs in her head. And I said, do you have songs in your head? And she said, oh, yes, whenever I'm talking to somebody, I have these songs. Sometimes I don't know them, but I'll just share the song. And then it's always just the right moment. I was saying, well, that's God. And she's like, but is he allowed to speak that way? I'm like, well, he created music. I'm pretty certain he's allowed to speak that way. So I think firstly, demystifying how God speaks is really important, because people expect so often the big grandiose moment, when often God's speaking is that still small voice. It's in the everyday little moments. So I think that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I often say to people is, what is it that makes your heart sing? So for me, if somebody were to ask me that question, I love movement. So being outside for me is just the best, because it's always moving. Nature's always moving. And I just, particularly the autumn, I'm insanely obsessed with the autumn, the changing colour of the leaves and collecting conkers, the whole thing. I love it. So when I'm outside, there's a natural sense in which my soul feels at ease. If you're doing something that creates that sense of ease inside, it's much easier to lean into hearing God's voice, because A, you're not striving, but B, you're connected with something the way that God created you to be. Now, it's not a surprise to me that I love to be outside. Movement matters to me in all forms. That's what culture change is. And yet everything that I really love is about movement. If it was who could sit the stillest competition, I would not win at all. It's who could sit and
Would
carry
you be
on
the
moving.
first one out?
Oh, entirely. Yeah, absolutely. No good at, those statue games, because who wants to be still? Entirely. I'm internally still, but I'd like to keep moving. So, but it's no surprise that therefore I connect with God in nature, because God created me with a heart for movement. And so he's also going to speak to me through the way he's created me. And so I think helping people to understand what makes their hearts sing, what makes them feel at rest, is a basis for helping them to lean in to hearing God's voice and demystifying how God speaks. And often I think for many, many people, God speaks through gut instinct and, intuition. And there's that beautiful verse in Joel that says, who gives instinct to the heart and instruction to the heart and instinct to the mind. It's a beautiful verse that kind of just shapes the fact that God speaks so frequently through gut feeling. If you think, Joseph just felt he had to, Jesus felt he had to. There's lots of moments of instinctiveness throughout Scripture. And for many people, the language of gut instinct is something that's more familiar, but helping them to connect that to be in a way that God speaks, I think is really a breakthrough point for many people in hearing God at all. And certainly for me, that's the way God often speaks, is that gut instinct.
It's a really tricky thing to describe, isn't it? Just the knowing,
Yeah.
that sense of,
Yeah.
the knowing that comes around something.
So often I think, I think often, there's moments where people say, they ring you and say, oh, I just kind of felt like I didn't know if you're okay, so I'd give you a ring. Well, it's helping people see that's a God moment. That's a God nudge. That's a God feeling. So if you can help trace little moments, I think it starts to help people build confidence that that's God speaking. And I think with God's voice, with everything, you have to, it's a muscle you have to exercise, and it's a muscle you have to grow in. And if you don't grow in it and you don't exercise, then it is going to be harder. So actually learning and seeing the little steps, I think, is essential.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So you lead out Accessible Prophecy in the UK. Tell us
I
a little bit
do.
about what you guys been doing.
Yeah, so we have been pushing into a lot of stuff around the creative space. So, thanks to the Reformation, we have a really good handle on the Bible and people reading the Bible and understanding all of these things. But actually, in doing that, I think we lost a lot of the creative ways that God spoke, through a burning bush, pillar of fire, through parting the sea. God spoke creatively. And the first thing that God does in Genesis is to reveal himself as a creator. And the second thing he does is speak. And yet many creators have lost any sense of understanding it's okay for them to create and translate into visual representations what it is that's on God's heart. And so we've been, we did a series of webinars around prophetic art, and we're incredibly surprised with the hunger and number of people that came. But also when you arrange webinars, if you get 40% of the people signed up, you're delighted. Do you know what I mean? But actually with the prophetic art, everybody would come. And
Wow.
and whilst it was advertised as prophetic art, we ended up with songwriters, poets, writers, artists. And so from that, we started a 6-session cohort, which we're in the middle of now, which tries to journey with some creators. Again, we've got poets, we've got songwriters, we've got writers, we've got artists. We've got somebody who does acrostics with God's voice, God speaks, and they're really incredible, actually. That it's fascinating to see how God's really speaking through that to people. And we're on this 6-week journey, and from that we're kind of probably do some sort of huddle, but we're trying to look at what might that look like. So for example, in our church, we've got an amazing prophetic artist who's going to be a prophetic artist in residence. So we're just working out, what does that mean to have a prophetic artist in residence in a church who is sensing, seeing, feeling, hearing, but translating that into visual things that help people connect with God's voice. We rent our building a lot as well. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how that works. So we're looking at what might a collective of creatives be, and how do we release people? If when we create, we're helping people connect to the Creator God, actually we need to harness that God's voice in those creatives, and that visual representation that comes, I think it opens a whole other area of people hearing God speak. So that's one thing we're doing at the moment. Our next innovation is around, what does it mean to be a prophet in the workplace? So I kind of always have this thing with prophecy. It's great, isn't it? But actually it needs to have flesh on it. So what does it mean to be a prophet as a parent? What does it mean to be a prophet in my marriage? What does it mean to be a prophet in my business? We often see it just in the church, but actually I work with lots of people in the marketplace who have a prophetic voice. What does it mean for them to use that in a secular situation? What does it mean to use that in a Christian situation? But actually, so that's going to be our next innovation, which we'll kind of lean into next year, which I'm really excited about, actually, because again, it's another area of release. But the creative thing is just an absolute joy to be part of. And we've got an amazing prophetic artist called Carolyn who's on our team. And she's just, her journey of really learning to hear God herself and to finally accept the call as a prophetic artist has just been a beautiful journey to witness. But watching her with the people that are coming is really incredible. And actually, one person from Canada came to our free workshop and was so inspired by her story, she multiplied it in Canada and immediately went and put on a prophetic workshop. So we were like, that's amazing. So I was just like, wow, that's just quite quick. So I think we're really excited to see what comes from that. But we've spent a lot of time I think when you read Genesis afresh again yourself, and you see that God revealed himself as creator first and somebody who speaks, and you just go, that's amazing, actually. And therefore, why, when there are so many people that hear God creatively, has that been minimized? So actually, it feels like God's releasing something afresh, and we are excited.
It's so exciting.
As well as that, we do all the standard things too.
It's we live in, with Google, such an information-rich world. There's something like truth, 8 billion Google searches a day. although I could just be making that up. But
sounds like a great number. Say it with authority, Chris. We'll believe you.
I know, 8 million.
8 million.
Google searches in a day. I probably do about 50 of them. But
yeah,
the
I'm glad you can't see my deck that's open at the moment.
But I love that sense and just that reminder around God's both creative, but there's, as you're talking there, I sit there going, we are constantly regenerating as humans, just our body, our cells regenerate. And so God creates that process, and it is such a creative process for regeneration, restoration. And I love that you've tapped into the heart of that creative heart of God to see that happen. Have you got any stories to share with us? You shared around the woman from Canada who multiplied, which ties in nicely to a previous conversation. What about some ways that God has been speaking creatively to people who are part of that cohort, or to yourself?
Well, I think it's been amazing, actually. So just to see the variety that's come. So Carolyn, the artist. So the way we run is we start with a listening exercise, as always. Everything accessible prophecy. We spend a bit of time hanging around. Okay, how did it go from last time? And we'll have some teaching, but everything we're doing in the creative, we're doing it's brushstroke, if you sense. Here's the overarching theme, and now what's God saying about that? And then Carolyn creates. For 20 minutes, she's on the screen creating, and everyone is creating around something we've set. But she never prepares in advance. So even watching what she's creating and then we all talk about what it was God was saying. I think what's been amazing is there's been, God has linked so many of the moments, and a piece that somebody has written here was just what this person needed here. There was somebody who'd gone for a walk a few days before and just felt prompted to take different random photos. And on the night, she pretty much had a photo for everybody that had created something that was almost the mirror image of what they were creating, thinking, sharing. So that was really spectacular. And one of the most beautiful things was accessible prophecy, we use a covenant statement quite a lot, but we actually had spent time looking at Jesus in Caesarea Philippi, saying, "Who do you think I am?" And we'd ask the question two ways. So, who do you say Jesus is? But also, who does he say you are as a creative prophet? And from that, they had created covenant statements which were based on that. And let me just grab one. There was one of the songwriters who's an incredible songwriter had given us permission to share this. But his covenant. Oh, sorry, I'm putting the wrong thing into my WhatsApp. Give me a moment. Here we go. So his covenant statement he'd written as almost as a mandate, a declaration, and he'd written, "I, Jimmy, prophet and poet and painter and preacher, songwriter, singer, musician and teacher, do solemnly swear to create, communicate, fabricate, articulate, by all imaginable and imaginative means, possible and as yet impossible, the truths, promises and principles of your story for your glory, walk the path laid out before me with the gifts you provide me, with each lyric loaded with love, each brushstroke a coded nudge, to keep on looking up and focus on our God above. Chords and tunes, shades and hues point to you, to all who praise is due. You have my soul and my heart and my mind, my brushes, notepads and guitars. Imaginer of heaven and its stars, let's create together. Speak, Lord, your servant is whistling. I thought that was amazing.
It was amazing.
It's really beautiful. But what's been really amazing is that when it's come to listening moments, the songwriters have ended up drawing something they don't do, and some of the artists have ended up creating poetry which perhaps they don't do. So it's almost as they've opened themselves up to being creatives hearing God's voice, God's just opening and magnifying this the beauty that is within them. And I think that's been the joy of seeing the God colours come into the world of who they're made to be and how they can use their art, their creations, their poems, their songs, their words to bring glory to God. So I think that there are more stories to tell, more stories to come, but I've been blown away. We had a needlepoint felting that was just incredible. So it's just been a real variety of things. And I think a lot of this was inspired by a lady in our church who is a prophetic crocheter. So God will send her to the wool shop, and she'll go into the wool shop and he'll choose the colours. And often she complains because she doesn't like them. And then they'll go home. In fact, the wool shop know her so much. When she goes in now, they say, well, just give you and God a moment. And then if we can help you, let us know, which I love that the wool shops just give you and God a moment.
That's awesome.
Isn't that incredible? So then she only, she doesn't have a pattern. So she just asks God what they're going to do. And as she's doing it, he'll be talking and say, pray for this, pray for this. She doesn't know who it's for at this point. And when the blanket's finished, she'll write down the kind of words that God has spoken and what the blanket's about. And God will tell her who it's for and she'll pass it on. And the stories that come back are incredible. She created one for my son years ago when he was just in a bit of a fearful phase about sleeping. And he is now nearly 17 and he still has the blanket, still calls it his God blanket. And if ever there's a moment of wobble in his world, the blanket comes out and life is back to normal because there's his God blanket and it's been prayed into and this is what it means in my life. And so I think a lot of our creative awareness grew from watching her and how much that helped people connect with God's voice. And so I think there are going to be lots more stories to tell.
Ceri, that's been such a rich time, and I love that we've talked a lot about multiplication. We've talked about God being the creative God, and just that sense, that last bit that you talked there is about stewarding and pushing into spaces that are a little bit uncomfortable for us and that may not be our usual go-to ways, but they're just such rich stories, and I'm so grateful for your time today. You are such a blessing to the UK church, and you're such a blessing to us in a global movement in accessible prophecy. So thank you so much for your time today, and we look forward to the next time.
It's always a joy to spend time with you, Chris. Take care.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Prophecy Project. We hope you've been encouraged as you've listened today. We would love to connect with you. You can do that by following Accessible Prophecy on Instagram and Facebook. If you have a question or topic you would like us to cover, please check the podcast information description for ways that you can connect with us and for links to resources, workshops, and coaching. We hope you'll join us for the next Prophecy Project podcast.